Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast, an exploration of the blurry line separating our physical world from our abstract realities. Conversations and stories, myths and reality, science and the gods we worship, the esoteric and the everyday. Come explore with me. Okay, hi Randolph. Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast.
Hi, Josh. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been very much looking forward to speaking to you. And we had started chatting just before I hit record, and you were kind of asking me questions about myself. So maybe I think it would be helpful before we dive into all your work, which I'm very curious about. Maybe I could just give you a little bit of a background on myself, a quick synopsis.
Sure, I'd appreciate how you got into all this.
Yeah, absolutely. So in actuality, I started down this path of curiosity about both on the science side and also on kind of the psychology and myth side. Because I grew up in a very fundamentalist religious setting. And
a Mormon family, if I recall correctly.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And probably even more probably a little bit more, I wouldn't maybe not say fundamentalist, but a little bit more isolated than most Mormons. My parents moved us to the countryside and chose to homeschool us. And so we were kind of this little I existed in this little bubble. And at some point, the stories and the mythology from that background didn't seem to benefit me anymore. It seemed to be holding me back more than anything. And so I stepped out of that framework, but in doing so, I needed to reconstruct kind of my understanding of reality. And part of that process was for the first time exploring much more on the scientific side of things. And that included the process of evolution. And I was saying to you earlier that that understanding the process of evolution really helped me out a lot. And what I mean by that is that prior to doing kind of a deep dive on it, like I did a deep enough dive on it that I went and I went and read a bunch of books on it, even to the point where I read Darwin's original book.
It's a good book. It's a good book.
It's very interesting. And
good read.
I came to see evolution as a process, which is, I think obviously the point, but to really see how the process works given a specific environment, a specific group of, say, a species or group that is trying to exist within that environment, and then the need for adaptation of traits to succeed in that environment and pass those traits on. And what I came to see that really helped me out is how everything was kind of connected in this way. Everything was kind of influencing everything else through this process, to the point where I came to see it not only as a biological phenomenon, but I almost see the history of culture and society and religion and even our own psychology as an evolutionary process.
All those kinds of things evolve also. It's a somewhat different process, but there's evolution everywhere. I go into a 7-Eleven store and I see evolution happening there because whatever people buy shows up on the shelves. I mean, people keep blaming the 7-Eleven owners for selling junk food. They'd be glad to sell bananas and apples of people that buy them, but a process of those 7-Eleven owners who focused on good, healthy foods have gone out of business a long time ago. And it's our choices that make the bad stuff on the shelves.
Yeah. And I think similar dynamics play out in groups of people, especially around ideologies and belief systems, where those who help support the belief system often they gain some kind of level of power or strength or notoriety in that belief system. And those who don't, they are ejected from the belief system. And so it's this kind of self-perpetuating cycle as well.
So you may or may not have read about it, Josh, but there's a whole field now called cultural group selection that looks at how some groups have members that do things that benefit the group and other groups don't. And this is a cultural transmission, not a genetic transmission of traits. And I'm also remembering at this moment, somebody that wrote a 15-volume history of the world. I remember it was a professional, but not high level. And the last book was putting it all together. And the author put it all together by saying, and the bottom line is Catholicism is going to continue to grow fast because they prohibit birth control. And
Yeah.
probably
Okay.
Mormonism continues to grow, as I understand it, because of its strategy of sending out young people
Yep.
to witness and bring more people into the faith, and encouraging people to have families too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely practices within the group that help it to adapt to whatever the environmental changes are going on. I even see a lot of policy changes as, as the tides of culture kind of move in different ways, that there is an adaptation and an adaptive process taking place.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So what do I've never heard about Mormons as being anti-evolution, especially. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. When I was growing up, I, you know, I probably received just the typical response. Well, I know I received just a typical response from my parents, who my mom homeschooled us. And so our science books were Christian based, not necessarily Mormon based, but Christian based. And her response to evolution was, I didn't evolve from monkeys,
Yeah.
which, beyond that, I don't know that there was a lot of even discussion about evolution. I think that if you go to BYU, Brigham Young University, and study in the sciences there, you will learn evolutionary
That's
principles.
what I
Yeah,
understood. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So can I turn this around on you and just ask you where did your interest in this evolutionary topic come from, or when did you really see a need to start focusing on it?
It really started off when I was an undergraduate, and an inspiring biology teacher named Patrick Milburn encouraged us to pick a big topic and write a term paper. And I decided to figure out, so why does aging exist at all? Because it doesn't seem very sensible for aging to exist. It makes you die. That can't be good for passing on a lot of genes. And so I came up with an idea that I thought was pretty good, that it was probably good for the species, for some individuals to get not knocked off every year so that there could be replacement and evolution could work faster. And that was a pretty neat idea, actually, at the time. When I went through medical school, I was preoccupied the entire time by all the things that seemed terribly designed in the body. Start with the appendix, go to the narrow birth canal, go to narrow coronary arteries, and the fact of atherosclerosis in most of us, autoimmune diseases in so many people. And then finally, when I started moving to psychiatry, it got worse yet. I mean, these mental disorders and problems weren't just problems for a few isolated people who had brain problems. There's problems for everybody. Everybody gets depressed and has anxiety sometimes. Some people have a way lot more than others. Um, so this made me constantly wonder about, who the heck designed this thing? Why on earth wasn't it better? And of course, the answer is that it was shaped by natural selection. And that led me to study emotions. And where we want to go with our discussion pretty soon is trying to figure out, so we feel so bad so often. Why? It overshoots. Yeah, anxiety is useful, but that much anxiety? Almost everybody has too much anxiety, or at least they think they have too much anxiety. And as for depression, whoa, I mean, that doesn't seem useful at all. So we can go there if you want to, or stick with other things before we get there.
No, I'm happy to go there. The only comment I have about your comment about everybody seeming to have some mental disorder at some time is there's this really common term now, neurodivergent, which basically kind of speaks towards different people who have mental challenges, mental disorders. But I think I agree with you where I look around and I think, well, how could it be neurodivergent if everybody I know has something? It doesn't seem like
I
anybody's
would
missed it.
draw a sharp line actually between, I mean, there's some problems that people bring to psychiatrists that are basically bad feelings, anxiety, depression, anger, that kind of stuff. And emotions are useful responses shaped by natural selection that are only useful if they go off in the right place and time. And natural selection shaped a mechanism to detect whether those situations are possible. I mean, when there's danger, and a fear response is good. When you might be about to do something that wrecks your marriage, anxiety is good. Um, so, but those are very different from these states that are stable over many years, such as autism and schizophrenia. obsessive compulsive disorder sticks around for ages as kind of a stable trait. Those are very different. I mean, some of those are diseases. And when people talk about neurodivergence, a lot of times they're talking about don't treat us as if we have a disease. And I'm sympathetic to avoiding the stigma of this disease talk and all the rest. On the other hand, a lot of them are diseases for most people, where they can't function well, and it would be awfully wonderful if this could be, if the cause could be understood and we can do something about it. But in my whole career of psychiatry, going on 50 years, our hope that we would find the brain causes and the genes and be able to fix things has been a desperate disappointment to all of us. It's just that's not how these things need to be understood. And people don't really know where to go next. And a group of us are suggesting that where to go next is to try to understand the answer to this new question. It's not what made this person sick, or what's the brain mechanism or psychological mechanism that causes problems for this person. Instead, the question is, why on earth was the whole system designed in a way that is vulnerable to that kind of failure? And this led me to general medicine. My first article about evolutionary psychiatry was 1984, and it was very quickly clear that I would have to first understand why natural selection left us vulnerable to physical diseases before I could make good sense to mental diseases. And it was my huge good fortune to have done that work on aging earlier. And that led me to knowledge about an article by a fellow named George Williams, a biologist who wrote it in 1957. And he had an explanation for aging, which still just blows me away. The same genes that make you age give you advantages earlier in life when selection is stronger, just because there's more people around. And even if it wasn't for aging, some people would die every year. And this is called antagonistic pleiotropy, if you want some really fancy jargon. And that just means same gene does multiple things in opposite ways. It's good at one time and bad at other times. But this is profound. I mean, there's an evolutionary explanation for aging. If there's an evolutionary explanation for aging, what about schizophrenia? What about OCD? What about major depression? What about bipolar disease? And I spent the whole rest of my career working on that. And now it's wonderful to find that there are dozens of other scientists and psychiatrists who are in this battle with us, trying to bring the basic science of evolutionary biology to psychiatry. We argue it's a missing foundation that can help psychiatry to move forward.
Those ones that you mentioned, ADHD, obsessive compulsive, autism, these are disorders that you're saying are well beyond the spectrum of just negative emotions or unpleasant emotions. But you also...
And the unpleasant emotions can be dysregulated in ways that makes them a real disease. I've seen patients with depression who lie in bed, unwilling to eat, unable to talk, unable to move. They're going to die unless somebody treats them. I mean, that's not just a bad feeling. That's full-fledged melancholic depression. So I think people imagine that the depression is just bad feelings. No, it's a real physical malady in some people. And we keep trying to simplify things. Josh, this is one of my bugaboos these days. I'm writing essays about we are all simplistic thinkers because we want things to be simple, and they're not.
Yeah. I think I grew up I think early in my life, the narrative was, this was like in the 80s, early 90s, the narrative was something to the effect of nothing's actually wrong with you, just toughen up. And then as I got older, I think the narrative shifted to chemical imbalance, which lately I've just seen a lot of things kind of discrediting that idea as well. But I guess my question is, and you might have alluded to this as well, but the thing that I hear now is genetics or some kind of structural anomaly in the brain itself. And it sounds like you're saying we haven't pinpointed it. It's just not that simple.
So let's try to put this in a larger context. Obviously, all behavior and speech and everything else comes from the brain. And people who have problems and disorders have brains that are different from other people. And those brains can be different because of genes, development, toxins, or just your life experiences, being abused or having good parents or having a wonderful partner in life or getting a good job. I mean, all these things influence us, but it's all via the brain. So there got to be brain differences. And that's perfectly logical. And I just have, I mean, I am not against neuroscience in any way. I mean, I still hope that we're going to find specific brain loci or specific genes or specific neurotransmitters or specific circuits that account for things like autism and schizophrenia. But now we've had 30 years of intensive work, spending hundreds of millions of dollars by brilliant people, and we haven't found any. And this means to me that we should keep looking. We got to keep looking, but we should also pull back and ask, why can't we find specific things? It's not like multiple sclerosis where you can find a particular, antibody attack on the myelin sheath of the nerves. And it's not even like Alzheimer's disease where you can see plaques and tangles killing off certain neurons. You keep looking in the brain for something like that, and we can't find it. Yeah, the brains of the people with bad depression are a little bit different, but not in ways that can make a diagnosis. So it's been a terribly frustrating, disappointing thing for all of us in psychiatry. Genes, too. Just before we got on, I was working on my current project about how genetic interactions may well account for why we can't find genes of large effect for many of these illnesses. And we can go into that in a minute if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is interesting. I also am curious. So when you kind of explored the idea of aging when you were younger, and then when you decided to explore this idea of the connection between biology and psychiatry, you went back to, just before getting to the kind of mental diseases or disorders, you went straight to just why do we get disease in general. And I'm curious again how maybe you could dive a little bit more into how that was a helpful exploration and how that helped inform you about the next step that you're interested in from a psychiatry perspective.
Yeah. Well, there's something I haven't mentioned, which is a crucial help that I got from biologists at the University of Michigan. And I was frustrated in psychiatry because it seemed to me it was lacking a solid scientific foundation. And my friends were either becoming psychoanalysts or behaviorists or psychopharmacologists or geneticists or cognitive behavioral therapists. And I thought there has to be some way to pull it all together because I was trying to use all of those ways of understanding disorders and treating my patients. And you can't be an academic and say, I'm eclectic, even if you are, because that's not really a field. On the other hand, when I started reading books about animal behavior, they were all based on evolution. I thought, wow, if all that's based on evolution, maybe abnormal behavior of animals and people is also based on evolution. So I found my way to the Museum of Natural History, where a well-known biologist named Dick Alexander, who inspired whole generations of biologists through creative thinking, invited me in, and I first told them about my theory about aging after I got used to it for a few weeks. And there was deathly silence first, and then little bits of laughter. And then a bunch of them said, "Oh, you don't really know anything about biology, do you?" I said, "Well, I've had this great education." And they said, "No, you don't even know that everything in biology needs two different kinds of explanation. One explanation about how does it work, what's the mechanism, and the other explanation is how did it get that way? How did that mechanism get that way?" So that completely opened up my mind. And then they explained the other thing that's been a preoccupation for my whole career, which is that natural selection does not shape us for health, happiness, welfare, cooperation. It shapes us to do whatever, shapes all organisms to do whatever maximizes the transmission of genes. And once you see that, and it's perfectly obvious, right? Because if some individuals, for instance, are, celibacy, I mean, there have been religious sects that are celibate. What happens to them? They go away pretty quickly. And likewise, people with genes that makes them just not want to have sex, that doesn't stick around very long either. What happens instead is people who want to have sex and children pass on more of their genes. And guess what? This makes children and having sex very important to most people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when it comes to these mental disorders, these psychiatric challenges, then there's obviously there's got to be a reason for how they're happening or how they're working, but then there's also got to be a reason for why they came about in the first place, or like an explanation.
Exactly right. And the first step most people take, and I'm going to stop you before you do it. Almost everybody, including me and George Williams when we first worked, is to say, "Oh, what's the advantage of having breast cancer? What's the advantage of heart disease? What's the advantage of, cystic fibrosis? What's the advantage of all these things?" And it took us a couple of months of talking before we realized that disorders do not have evolutionary explanations. They are not traits shaped by natural selection. And we shifted the focus, and that made all the difference and led to the growth of the field of evolutionary medicine. The shift was from trying to explain the evolution of diseases to explaining traits that everybody in the species has that makes them vulnerable to diseases. And now we're talking about things like the narrow birth canal and the appendix, and also an aggressive immune system that causes autoimmune diseases, and an immune system that's not quite good enough, nonetheless, to conquer all infections. And the lining of your aortic arteries or the arteries in your heart gets inflamed, and atherosclerotic plaque goes on there. Whoa. Would be really good if that wasn't there at all, except you need to have a capacity for inflammation. So it's not that atherosclerosis is useful. It is that the capacity for inflammation in your arteries to prevent bacteria from going back and forth is essential. That's the crucial thing. So one thing I want every listener to take away from this podcast is that evolutionary psychiatry does not argue that diseases and disorders are useful or evolutionarily selected for. It argues that many traits that natural selection left us with, everybody in the species, make us vulnerable to disorders.
Yeah, it's this interesting idea that natural selection should prepare us for every single potentiality in the environment, when in reality, as long as you were good enough, or as long as our ancestors were good enough, then they would have moved on to the next, they would have survived and reproduced. But it doesn't mean that they were impervious to all afflictions. And so
Yeah,
we also carried on those vulnerabilities that they had. And, our environment is clearly different than the environment of our ancestors. And especially when it comes to these kind of mental challenges.
that's for sure. And one of the main insights we had in evolutionary medicine is the large proportion of disease that's caused by living in abnormal modern environments. And if you make rounds in any hospital and just stop at each bedside and ask, would this person be there if they had been living in an ancestral environment? Almost all the breast cancer patients, no. Almost all the bowel cancer patients wouldn't be there. Almost everybody with heart disease would not be there. Those diseases are much, much more rare for people who live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But that's not to say that their health was better back then. No, they were getting infections and dying all the time. Our health is much better now. It's just the diseases we have are mostly products of living in a modern environment.
Yeah, that makes sense as well. Obviously they suffered.
Actually, I shouldn't say mostly. A lot. Let's not do mostly.
Well, especially, and maybe we shouldn't say especially either, but when we're talking about, obviously biologically, we've made a lot of advances just simply by having clean water, hot water. We have sewage so we can flush, toxins away.
And enough food.
Yeah, like enough food, drier, cleaner living environments. So obviously,
let's pause a second. Isn't food great these days?
Oh, it's amazing. In fact,
whatever you want,
anything you want, taste, anytime, anywhere. Yeah.
It's fabulous. The kings of old couldn't begin to imagine the luxury that most of us live with in terms of having any taste and combination we want at any time of day or night. On the other hand, it kills us.
Yeah.
On the other hand, and we try to eat less, and then most of us get heavy.
Yeah. Well, it's delicious. It's like it's one of those things that we're clearly not adapted for, is to have such great selection. I mean, even just to kind of linger on this. If you go to the grocery store, you can get almost anything you want at the grocery store and bring it home and cook it. But at the same time, there's a restaurant in every, even medium-sized city for every flavor that you want from across the globe. And so,
Right,
yeah, the
right.
selection is just unreal. And I think from an ancestral perspective, it was probably, you were working really hard to have the same type of food over and over and over and over, especially given the seasons. And now
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
just an abundance.
Without much salt or spice or anything else, but you were hungry, and you ate when you could as much as you could and stuffed it in because you didn't know when you were going to get. I mean, that's not generally true, but a lot of times that was true. But let's talk a minute about the evolution of our food supply, because people blame the fast food restaurants for serving healthy food. And they blame 7-Eleven for having, bad stuff in the shelves. And they blame grocery stores or promoting highly processed foods. Maybe the one good thing of our current leaders of health policy in this country is to try to, reduce our dependence on highly processed foods and the like. However, how did they get onto the shelves? I mean, the makers of food who have stuff that is not with the exact right combinations of fat, salt, sugar, uh, we don't buy that stuff. And so this is I mean, they're constantly responding to consumer demands by giving us exactly what we want, and it's not good for us at all.
Yeah. Well, they even within that food process, that food, getting it to from farm to table, the the companies that are making that food are also studying evolution. Am I wrong?
Not really. I mean, they're just putting out different products and seeing what sells, most of them. But that
Okay.
is a process in itself of evolution within an economy,
Yep.
and the like.
So maybe from a biology perspective, there are modern challenges to health, and likewise in the past there were challenges to health that our ancestors faced. But do you think that from a psychology perspective, we suffer more now than our ancestors would have in the past, given the environment change?
That's such a good question, Josh. I mean, it seems pretty obvious that so many people are miserable now, that it must have been better back then. But that's a delusion that most people have about everything. In Roman times, Seneca was talking about it was so much better 100 years ago, you know? So I think this is, we tend to forget bad things in the past and see them in the present. That's a wonderful part of human cognition.
What do you have to go far enough back before, do you have to go far enough back to when it was just familial tribes,
I
hunter
mean,
gatherers, or do
I
they
mean,
also
hunter-gatherer people
suffer?
all hold up hunter-gatherer lifestyles, and I must say, the idea of living in a small group where there's no king, and if people get too uppity and try to boss you around, they get kicked out, and there's family all around all the time. It's really a marvelous image. And I think probably I talk with anthropologist friends constantly about this. In many ways, people are enmeshed in a secure social group of family. And that makes it completely different from moving to a different city and starting a job and trying to meet people. So loneliness and that kind of isolation is just not an issue. On the other hand, you are trapped in your social group. In those, in many bands, you can leave one band and go to another family band safely. But in other places, you're stuck with your group because if you are kicked out of your group, you might as well die. You're dead. Um, and this is very important, though. We all care so much about what other people think about us because I think in large part being excluded from the group wasn't just feeling bad, it was death.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the same psychological pressures that people feel when they have groups based on ideas, and to be pushed out of those groups and to not know where to go in the world it is a fear similar to death.
And it leads to conformity within groups. I mean,
Yep.
people tend to talk about things that are central to the group's ideology. It doesn't even have to be Republicans and Democrats, although they both do it dramatically. Religious groups obviously have creeds, and everybody's supposed to repeat the creed, and demonstrate every week that they are obedient to the mores and the creed. And woe to anybody who says, this doesn't sound right to me.
Yeah, well, you see it at every level of every group in society where it could be religions, it could be politics, but it could also be sports teams, it could be businesses, it could be Cub Scout troops. Like every one of them has a culture that you're expected to buy into. So do you think then that the our ancient ancestors felt this pressure as well, and because there was some form of was there a form of denial of self that led to similar types of anxieties, depressions that we face today?
I just don't know. I wish I could have spent years living with a hunter-gatherer tribe, or the closest we have these days, to have some way of answering these questions, but I really don't. One wonderfully sophisticated anthropologist I know well is Kim Hill, who's gathered real data about several cultures and lived with them for many, many years, a very brave, good scientist. And every year when he came back from the field, I'd say, "Hey, Kim, how much depression did you see? Did you see depression?" He said, "No, not really. I saw people with abscessed wisdom teeth that were oozing for a year. They didn't have depression. I saw people with bad tuberculosis. They didn't have depression." Then one time he came back and I said, "Do you see any depression?" He says, "Well, actually, we did. We started a clinic." And if Kim hears this, Kim, forgive me, I'm going to grossly simplify the situation you told me. But he said, "Yeah, we started a clinic and we started seeing people who said, 'I can't sleep. I've lost my appetite. I just don't want to do anything. I'm nervous all the time. I think demons have gotten into me." And all of a sudden he was in, I mean, these are things that he hadn't been very aware of before they started a clinic. But guess what? People bring the same kinds of problems to a clinic in the jungle as they do to a clinic in a modern city. So interesting that many things stay the same. And then you have to ask yourself, why the heck are these unpleasant emotions going off excessively, or are they excessive?
Yeah, and what do you think about that?
So that preoccupied. I mean, I helped to develop one of the first anxiety disorders clinics. George Curtis started it, and other people who've carried on since then. But it was a wonderful experience taking a disorder that had not been that thoroughly researched and finding new kinds of treatments and all the rest. After doing that for about 10 years, I asked myself, not just why this person has anxiety, but why is anxiety so common in everybody, including me? I mean, and I started thinking about that from what's called a signal. And once I realized that anxiety is useful, I realized that it was shaped by natural selection along with mechanisms that regulate its expression. So it goes off to the right degree in the right situation. So if you see a lion at a long distance through a telescope, that you feel, oh, well, that's cool. If you smell a lion's hot breath on the back of your neck, you are terrified and you run with a high heart rate and everything else. But a lot of people run away from spiders that are harmless. A lot of people can't really speak in public, even in groups that are kind of friendly. A lot of people, many of our patients, people have no idea how bad anxiety is. We had people who haven't left their trailer in 2 years because every time they step on the steps, they get a panic attack. We saw people who dropped out of high school because they were afraid of being called on in class. We saw executives who couldn't ride the elevator up to the 20th floor, so they had to climb every time and make excuses to clients, even though they were a vice president of a major corporation. I mean, all these things made me wonder, why on earth are these things going off excessively? How did natural selection shape the regulation system? I said, well, it's got to be that it shaped it to maximize the benefits given the costs. And then I thought to myself, what are the costs of having a panic attack? Well, that's about 100 calories in about 10 minutes. And what are the costs of not having a panic attack? Well, if there's no danger, there's no cost. If there's a lion coming near you and you don't have a panic attack, it's liable to be death. And this came up with, after working on this and with what's called signal detection theory, a mathematical model, I came up with the idea of what's now called the smoke detector principle. And the idea is very simple. It is that these responses, if they're optimal, are going to go off whenever the cost is less than the benefit. And the cost of having anxiety and a panic attack is generally pretty low. And the benefit might be huge. And this is why this changed how I practice with my patients. Previously, I told them, "You've been to the grocery store 3 times. I've been with you 3 times in the last month, and nothing bad has happened." I felt like telling them, "How come you're still having so much anxiety?" But now that I had this evolutionary perspective, I realized, wait a second, uh, if in fact this person is having fear that there's something life-threatening that might happen, um, then it makes perfect sense that you're going to get a lot of false alarms in the system. So just like we put up with false alarms in our smoke detectors, because we want to always be warned about a bad fire, the natural selection has shaped these regulation mechanisms to give us way more anxiety in many situations than is good in that situation. Over the long run, it might be about right, but it makes for awful misery for so many people. And worse yet, it can go into positive feedback spirals where you start fearing the fear itself. So you experience a little high heart rate, think, oh my God, I'm having a panic attack. And guess what that does? It causes anxiety that you might have a panic attack. And what does that do? It makes your heart rate go up. And now what does that do? And just spirals right up into a full-blown panic attack.
Yeah, I know that experience because I've had, well, throughout my life, for whatever reason, I've had fainting experiences. I've had a couple of like head, like something actually hit me in the head and caused me to pass out.
Uh-huh.
But then I've also just had experiences where I'm standing there and all of a sudden I pass out. And it's this weird thing where it hasn't happened to me in a long time, but it's this weird sensation where for about just a few seconds before it happens, you can feel it about to happen.
Yipes. Yeah.
And then I did go through a period of about a year, year and a half, maybe 2 years, where I was having panic attacks. And the thing that was the worst about those panic attacks was the feeling that I would pass out, because the panic attack itself was very similar to the feeling of passing out. And the irony, or maybe the strange thing, is that in none of those panic attacks did I ever pass out.
Right.
But the
Right.
feeling alone of like, oh no, like it would happen
What
while
if?
I'm
What if? What if?
yeah, exactly. That's the fear. And it escalates it because you're driving. And for me, a lot of the times it was if I was in a really crowded space or if I was driving and the road started to get really crowded, because I would get this sense that if something happened right now, I'm stuck. I'm stuck in this place. And then I would get this feeling in my body, and it would be very similar to the feeling that comes on before passing out. And it would
That's
create
right.
this ramped up cycle of, yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's a perfect example, Josh, of this positive feedback stuff. For most people, that some well-meaning doctor in the emergency room where they go with their panic attack says, you know, we've checked you out. It's not a heart attack. I think you're going to be okay. But if it happens again, come back really fast. And so from then on, they're monitoring. Is it going to happen again? Is it happening again? And soon, and of course, you know, one reason or another, you get a rapid heart rate. The person think, oh my God, it's happening again. I go to the ER and just these are what there's a fancy name for this. It's called iatrogenic. A lot of panic disorders are iatrogenic because doctors, well-meaning doctors, offer warnings to come back quick if something like that happens because they don't know how to diagnose the panic. I think people are better at it now than they used to be.
Yeah. It's interesting then because from an evolutionary perspective, well, evolution doesn't really care that much about our actual experience. It's not like this sentient thing that cares about our happiness, about whether or not the panic attack actually disrupts our day-to-day life.
That's so disturbing to me. I mean, natural selection doesn't give a fig about that. Doesn't give a fig about our happiness or even how long we live. It doesn't care about anything, of course. Really, it's a completely mindless process where those individuals who have genes that make brains that make them do things that have longer survival and more offspring, those genes get passed on. But it's not just have, I mean, a lot of people take that knowledge and say, oh my God, sex is the all important thing. Yeah, sex is pretty important, but there's something equally important, that is taking care of kids, taking good care of kids. And people ask me, so what has evolutionary psychology ever proved or explained? And I say, well, it explains why people love their kids so much. They really care about their kids and more about their kids than other people's kids. And it's a wonderful thing that people really care about their kids, except for when they don't.
Yeah, it's a shame when they don't. I almost think it's got to be some kind of pathology when people don't care about their kids. And
In general, yeah. In general, yes. Although there are circumstances where, you know, parents and not just humans, but chimpanzee parents and others have to make terrible choices between whether doing things to save a child or, in general, they choose saving a child. But I mean, we've had a couple of raccoons going across our lawn recently. you do not want to mess with baby raccoons because that big old mother raccoon, she's going to come right after you, no matter what the risk.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting because well, I was perusing like the first chapter of your book, and you give a story about a
Which
patient.
book is that? Good
The
Reasons for Bad
Good
Feelings?
reasons for bad feelings, yeah. And you talk about a woman who comes to see you, and I think you identify her as Miss A or Mrs. A,
Yep.
and she gives this narrative of trying to figure out her own challenges with anxiety and worry. And you go through this list, or she goes through this list of saying, I went to my priest, and I went to my doctor, and I went to a therapist, and every one of them gives a different, a different diagnosis with a different solution. And
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting because it was faith, family, faith, the family doctor, Freud, and then pharmaceuticals. And when you talk about this, all just popped into my head because you were talking.
Before we got to finish that anecdote, though. Do you recall from the book what she said as she touched the doorknob and left my office?
Yeah, she said something about the psychiatry.
She said, and then she says, so good of her. She says, and she was hard to calm her down, first of all, and to say, everybody has something to offer, and we're going to try to provide what we think is the best treatment and the like. But and her last thing she said as she left my office, she said, Dr. Nesse, your profession is very confused. You know that, don't you? And it just brought me up short to have somebody say it so clearly. Um,
Yeah. Well, that ties into exactly what I was thinking when you were talking about everything being about sex, because that is kind of the Freudian thought process, is that everything is in some way tied to sex.
and
And
pause. He was kind of right.
yeah, he is
He was
kind of
kind of
right.
right because
Yeah,
it's really all about reproduction.
that's right. And then, but similar to what you were saying, beyond reproduction, there's also the fostering of what you've reproduced. And
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
I do a lot of so one of the frameworks or models, whatever the best term is, that has really helped me is evolution. But another one that's helped me is just I read a lot of Carl Jung and depth psychology, and he was kind of like a contemporary of Freud. They actually worked together a little bit, and Freud wanted him to be his protege, but it was
So
almost
he was kind of the Elon Musk to the Donald Trump, and they had a really serious falling out,
yeah, just recently, right? Uh,
as Jung and Freud did.
that's right. Yeah, and a lot of it was based on that idea of sex, everything being about sex, and in a way, just like you said, Freud was kind of right. I think Jung kind of agreed with him, but from a Freudian perspective, the libido is all about sex. But from a
No,
Jungian,
I mean, kind of, but Freud's notion of libido was somewhat broader than that. He thought that was sexual energy at root that led to everything, but it wasn't just having sex. It was this kind of energy that was in the mind that had to go someplace. It was literally a hydraulic model where if there was too much pressure in the can, things will explode, then this pressure from the libido had to be let off someplace. And he was very wise in recognizing that it could go into all kinds of different directions, including creativity, and all the rest.
and in at some stage, well, you go through different stages in your life, and so that pressure or the process of releasing that pressure is going to focus on different things, and at some point, you get to an age where you're past the point of reproduction. But whether you're focused on your own children or you're just focused on giving back to your group, to society, your tribe, whatever it is, in some way, there's that energy is going to be there to also help support the group with knowledge, with experience, with training, where you see it a lot.
I
Yep.
wanted to respect Freud's insight about there being kind of a central reproductive thrust to what organisms do, and not just humans. But the mind is much more structured than that. And evolutionary psychologists, and I was part of the organizers of the very first Human Behavior and Evolution Society, the mind has structure. And it's not just, certain kinds of energy swirling around and trying to go someplace. It is just like with every organism, detecting certain circumstances and behaving in ways in those circumstances. Actually, at this moment, right in front of my window, there are two little chipmunks chasing each other. Can you guess who's chasing whom?
I could probably guess that the male's chasing the female.
The poor female is being abused and harassed and stuff, and somebody should do something about it. But that's it's pretty easy to interpret why that happens from an evolutionary point of view. And now we get into the complexities of human mating relationships. There's people try to simplify them and say we're basically polygynous, we're basically monogamous. Yeah, we sure are a lot more monogamous than almost every other primate. But that's not kind of a pure monogamy. It's something that natural selection shaped because it really takes two humans to raise a baby up to the point where they can be self-sufficient. And that probably is responsible for all kinds of things, ranging from how long people go wanting sex, not just when the female's fertile, but across the whole year. I mean, all kinds of things start making. There's a book by a woman named Bobby Lowe, a colleague and friend of mine here at the University of Michigan, called Why Sex Matters. And if your readers want to get into something really good, they could read that book that reveals where sex came from, not just for humans, but for all creatures. And just like the title says, why sex matters.
Is it a play on words given the material is or like the matter of it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, not so much, but it's a good book.
Yeah. Well, I want to circle back around to you go into this study of biology and psychiatry, how they're tied together through adaptive or evolutionary processes. But so we've gotten to the point where we say, okay, the body is vulnerable in some ways, and there are times when anxiety is good for you, even if the cost benefit is usually leans towards more anxiety, perhaps. But so what's to be done if somebody doesn't want their anxiety to be constantly bothering their life?
So in general, I don't think there's no special evolutionary psychiatry kind of treatment, in my opinion. But I do think that evolutionary thinking can inform all kinds of treatment, from psychotherapy to drug treatment to cognitive behavioral therapy to family therapy. I mean, understanding what emotions are and how they work and how they're regulated is crucial for dealing with all of these kinds of things. But no special kind of therapy. I mean, my attitude towards what you do for patients is first you try to understand how that person came to have that particular kind of problem as best you can. And then you talk with the person to try to figure out what's likely to work for them. And you explain to them that you're going to find something eventually that works, but what we're going to try first is this. And it might be medications for one patient, it might be psychotherapy for another, it might be family or marital therapy for another. For a lot of people, the first thing is to stop drinking or to stop using drugs, which is kind of an underlying thing that we haven't talked about yet. Another product of modern environments that's just a scourge on our species. Um, but I'm very much an advocate of real individualized assessment and treatment of a sort that's really hard to get because most psychiatrists see so many patients because there's such a need. They can't spend 90 minutes or 2 hours like I was able to with each new patient trying to get to know them, and they can't see them back for follow-up sessions as frequently as needed. Instead, they've got to do something. And besides, it costs a lot more to put a psychiatrist online for treating people than a social worker or a nurse clinician. And so the psychiatrists end up mostly diagnosing and prescribing, and other people do other kinds of treatment. That's probably the most efficient way to do it. But I sure loved the early years of my career when I was able to, thanks to the privileged position I had at the university, treat almost all patients optimally with seeing them as often as I needed to, thanks to support from the state that provided backup for people who didn't have income, and using medications and psychotherapy, using everything, depending on what a patient needed. I just love that. It's hardly possible now, though, with the structure of insurance and finances in general.
Yeah. So optimal treatment being
Individualized.
seeing everybody as an individual and then working with them to understand individually what's causing the symptom, what's the underlying disease, disorder,
And
trauma, whatever it may
for
be.
depression and anxiety, I mean, I do have a bit of a scheme that you might have come to if you read further in the book. And it's basically using principles from behavioral ecology about the six main resources that all animals strive for. And we are constantly reallocating our efforts to get the right balance between these. And it's hard. It all spells out social, SOCIAL. The first is social resources, friends and status in an environment. O for occupation, something you do that other people appreciate, whether it's paid or not, but something that other people value. C for children and family, kin who share your genes. I for income and material support. A for abilities and health and attractiveness, physical resources, personal resources. And the last one is love and sex, SOCIAL. And if you go through with a person and spend about 10 minutes on each of those saying, how's it going in that area? What do you have? What do you want? What are you trying to get? How's it going? How do you think it's going to work out? How are you feeling about it? That's a very long process. That takes an hour just to go through that. But when I do that, and when some of my students do that, you learn things about a person's life that you don't get from just chatting with them and saying, how are things going? Are you having any stress? How's your marriage? When you go through these things, you learn about people who are saying, I got to spend more time on my job, otherwise I'm going to lose my job. But my wife says she's going to leave me if I keep staying out late until midnight at my work. And, you realize what people are really up against.
Yeah. And if you go through each one of these, I think it's a great list because when I look at it, I just think, oh, these are just the things that people need to have like a full, balanced, kind of wholesome life. And if you're
Not just people, every organism,
right.
every
Yeah.
social organism.
And
That's why these are so powerful. And this is real biological psychiatry, I would say, because this is doing the kind of biological analysis of an individual's life that we would do for the life of a bird or an antelope or anything, trying to figure out how they allocate their effort depending on the circumstances.
yeah, absolutely. And I could see how imbalance in any one of these spheres could then you cause some kind of issue and then also bleed into the other spheres as you try to balance it out in some way. And then obviously, yeah, it kind of goes back to this idea though that if you don't have these things, then I don't know, maybe do you agree that you could kind of lump all of this into kind of this bigger category of environment? Like do you have a healthy, balanced environment from a human perspective? Or I guess from any, like you said,
Yeah,
any.
partly it's what you created, but partly, as you emphasized, Josh, these environments are also out there. And if you join certain kind of jobs or if you join the army, you got to do what they tell you to. It doesn't matter what you want to do. You're really kind of trapped in there. This whole idea of social traps is also an idea that I find really useful in the clinic because people get into situations and a lot of them aren't very easy to get out of, even when they're not going very well. Marriages that aren't going well are especially that way, or having a job and you've been there for 20 years and the boss will give everybody else promotions but not you. So what do you do exactly? Jump to another job where you're probably going to have to take a big pay cut? Not really. That's not a good idea. Or yell at the boss, then you're going to lose your job. And people get in these bad situations because of the nature of social structures. And then some people say, oh, we can blame society. If only, we could all have more secure jobs with nicer bosses and better relationships. That sounds good. We should try for that. I'd love to see political changes that would make people feel more secure, and especially in the USA. At every moment, everybody seems to be vulnerable, even more so now than ever. Health insurance, bankrupting people, it's just a dire situation. It doesn't have to be that way. But we need to recognize the reality of some of these problems in people's lives, and we need to recognize how so many people cope remarkably well with dealing with these bad situations, and the fact that None of us can have all that we want or even most of what we want. And yet most of us can be pretty happy most of the time anyhow. And there's this marvelous, these are the psychodynamic defenses, I think, that Freud talked about but didn't really recognize so much the function of how wonderful they are at keeping us from focusing on what we don't have. What's important to not keep trying to do things that you can't succeed at.
Yeah, that's very stoic. There are obviously large or macro environment issues that each one of us as individuals are not going to be able to tackle. I would love to see the world become far less war driven. I would love to see politics change. I would love to see a lot of things. So maybe there is a sphere that I'm encased within, but I don't have a lot of control over. But when you narrow it down to everybody's individual lives, these 6 things that you listed out in the acronym social, and then just the thought that as humans, I think from an evolution perspective, one of the things that seems pretty unique to humans is that we do alter our environment. We have an ability to change things in a way that other species don't. It's why I think, it's why we're so adaptable in every terrain and every climate and every elevation across the globe. And so when I look at this list of social, for this list of, things that people could work on in their lives and think about social traps, the way I often think about it is, it maybe instead of the word social traps, I use stories where people get trapped in this idea that they're supposed to be living in a certain way. They're supposed to be playing out a certain story. And it can be extremely difficult for people to step outside of that. Similar to the way that we talked about earlier, you mentioned being cast out of a group or cast out of a tribe. And in a way, every time that, many times when we go to rebalance these things, we go to rebalance our friends group, we go to rebalance our occupation, we go to rebalance our family. There's this fear that we're going to be rejected, that we're going to be cast out. And I think that a lot of people struggle mightily to bring order into their own personal lives in these categories. But from an evolutionary perspective, it seems like we all do have a little bit of control within our own little sphere to bring some of this balance.
So a lot of people, I think, these days have the idea that there is such a thing as a normal life, where you have good satisfaction in every area of life. And worse yet, people are leaning in to go for it and have everything and have grand careers and blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that's possible for very many people. It is possible, I think, to have satisfying relationships with spouses and children and a job and a position in society and the like. But there's so many pressures to go for it all at once, which I think leads many people to just feel like their lives aren't measuring up. I'm sorry, it's not possible to have everything as far as I can tell. And it's a matter of trying to put your energies into places that are satisfying and find a group and a social niche where you're appreciated, and try to cope in the midst of all of that.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. We also have this innate desire to achieve what we've seen other people achieve, or
Yeah.
possess what we've seen other people possess.
And envy is such a great emotion, isn't it? It's just awful. But there's a whole book about envy and that I read years ago. I haven't read much more about it from an evolutionary psychology standpoint. It wasn't even an evolutionary book, but envy is useful. It gets people to do things that are working for other people, especially things that are raising status or bringing in more resources. And but then the other part of it is it motivates trying to tear down people who are succeeding. Only those who are slightly above you, right? Not those who are way above you. So it leads to fairly nasty competition as well. So it's both a bad emotion, but it's one that's kind of inevitable given the structure of social life.
Well, I think it could be a bad emotion if you let it fester inside of you in a negative way. But if you
Mhm.
can just control the story you're telling yourself about your envy, where you can look at people who are just slightly ahead of you or way ahead of you in the same trajectory, and if you can look at them and say, wow, like this is inspiring, this
I could
motivates
do
me.
that, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it can be actually a very very useful thing. But
I
again,
could
I
start.
think
I could start a successful podcast.
exactly, exactly, yeah.
I think
Um,
it's a wonderful thing, though. I mean, so many people who, that have decided they can start podcasts, and they're doing wonderful podcasts.
yeah, for me, it's just I watched other people have podcasts, and I thought I never really thought, oh, I want to have that amplitude or like I want to be able to be famous or anything. But the conversation that you and I are having right now, I wanted to take part in those. And to
Yeah,
me,
yeah.
it's like really fun, and it's even this one itself has been very informative. It's been fun and enjoyable, and in that way, envy has served me a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
All of these emotions have positives and negatives, and that's just the way they are.
Yeah, well, we are up on our hour. So, Randy, I really, really appreciate this time that you've taken with me, and it's given me a lot to think about and to dive deeper into. Are there any parting words you would like to share before we wrap up?
For anybody who's interested in this, I've got a website with most of my articles and lots of other videos available for free. And then there's a book that got you into this, I think. It's called Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, and it's an introduction to evolutionary psychiatry, but it's written for general audience, not for fancy psychiatrists. And I think people would enjoy it.
Yeah, I can echo that. It's a very readable book, and it flows very easily. So
Yeah.
well done with that. And what's the website? Do you know the URL for
I
your website?
just put my name in Google. It'll take you to randolphnesse.com.
Okay, awesome.
And,
Well,
and I've got a new Substack. Actually, I've just started. I've long written essays and put them on my website, and now I've moved them to my new Substack called Nesses, Essays by Nesse.
yeah, that's great. Okay, well, I'll be sure to post that as well on the show notes. But
Okay. Great
thanks,
talking with you,
yeah,
Josh.
thanks again, Randy.
Bye bye.